Welcome to another story made by Oracle One. In a world reshaped by climate catastrophe and ruthless governance, the very air you breathed was no longer free. Oxygen was metered. It was taxed. It was a commodity controlled with a cold, iron grip, and for millions it was the difference between life and death. This is the story of one man's desperate fight to protect his son from a system designed to squeeze the breath out of them all. Jackson Cale sat at the edge of their cramped apartment window in New Chicago, the skeletal skyline etched against a burnt orange dusk. The city was suffocating. Pollution hung over it like a shroud, and the government's oxygen distribution system was the only thing keeping people alive, if they could afford it. Jackson's fingers trembled as he looked at the small digital meter embedded in their rusty wall. It blinked a warning: oxygen credits dangerously low. His son, Eli, lay on the cracked leather couch behind him, eyes fluttering open briefly as a coughing spasm racked his slight chest. Asthma was a curse in any era, but in this one it was a death sentence cloaked in cruel hope. They had to have oxygen tanks to survive, but with the increasing tax hikes, each breath became a calculated gamble. Jackson ran a hand over his rough beard, feeling the weight of his own oxygen mask pressing against his face. The masks were meant to filter out the toxic particles in the air, but at this price, they felt more like shackles. The government had tightened controls in the last 5 years, ever since the great atmospheric collapse shifted the balance of air on Earth. Once breathable and free, oxygen was now rationed like water in a desert, precious, scarce, and fiercely controlled. There had been protests once, rallies that spilled across the streets screaming for free air. But the system's enforcers had efficiently silenced dissent. Air marshals were patrolling with drones overhead, responding to unauthorized oxygen usage with lethal force. The economy had been twisted into a web of oxygen credits, linked to biometric scans, making black market siphoning almost impossible. Jackson knew every day they stayed put, they edged closer to death's door. He looked down at Eli's fragile form again. His son was only 10, but his lungs were already compromised beyond repair. Every trip outside required a reserve tank. Every night needed a full oxygenator to keep him breathing comfortably. Jackson had siphoned whatever extra credits he could from his overtime shifts at the distribution plant, but it was never enough. The knock at the door shattered the quiet. Jackson's heart jumped. He covered the sound of Eli's stifled cough by coughing himself, then moved cautiously to the door. Through the peephole he saw 2 air marshals clad in bulky gray armor, helmets reflecting the faint glow from the street lamps. They glanced left and right, collecting data through retinal scanners. "We are here to perform a compliance check," a voice buzzed through an intercom attached to the lock. "Have your oxygen credits available for inspection." Jackson's mind raced. The last thing they needed was the marshals confiscating whatever tanks they had, or worse, penalizing them for sub-threshold oxygen usage. He opened the door slowly, keeping a calm voice. "Of course. Please wait a moment." He hurried inside, signaling Eli to stay quiet and still. The boy's fingers twitched on the blanket. He looked weak but determined not to give anything away. Jackson scanned their small terminal, checking the meter. They had maybe 2 minutes of oxygen credits left. Not enough to get through the inspection comfortably. When the marshals entered, their boots thudded heavily on the floor, their helmets whirring with circuity adjusting to the oxygen sensors. Jackson could read the tension in their movements. They were not here to make friends. One of them gestured at the meter. "Why is your account credit low? This reflects poor compliance." Jackson forced a smile that felt like a knife twisting in his chest. "We're saving credits. Rationing carefully. My son, he doesn't need full dosage all the time." The marshal's visor flickered red for a second. A bug in the system maybe, or something more sinister. Medical conditions require immediate notification. Unauthorized rationing will be penalized. Jackson swallowed. Can you have some compassion? We're just trying to survive here. The other marshal, colder and more imposing, stepped forward. Compassion is a resource in deficit. Compliance overrides emotion. Jackson's fist clenched. He was not going to let them take their precious oxygen. Not Eli. Not today. He made a decision that would change everything. I'm sorry, he said, voice steady but firm. But we need to go. Now. The marshals reacted instantly, raising their stun batons. But Jackson had already grabbed Eli in his arms and dashed for the back emergency exit he rarely used. The stale, thick air of the stairwell was a shock, but a fleeting opportunity. As they barreled down the steps, alarms blared behind them. Footsteps followed fast. They were on the run. The night was dark and cold, punctuated only by the roaring hum of distant air purifiers and the relentless clatter of drone patrols zeroing in. Jackson clutched Eli tighter, wrapped in a thin jacket that barely held warmth. His lungs burned with every breath, but he refused to slow. He ducked into shadowed alleys, slipping underground into the crumbling subway tunnels that no longer ran trains, only underground streams of desperate fugitives. For days, they moved cautiously through the steel graveyard of old New Chicago, scavenging oxygen canisters where they could, avoiding detection by air marshals and drones. Eli's condition worsened. Each coughing fit shook Jackson like a rag doll. The boy's skin was wan and pale, his breath shallow. The rationed doses from stolen tanks were never enough. Jackson knew they couldn't last in the city, not with the network of air detection systems so tightly woven. A whispered rumor had reached his ears a week earlier, a sanctuary beyond the eastern barrier, an old reclaimed forest where clean air supposedly still lingered. No official maps showed it, and the government denied its existence, but underground channels spoke of it as the last hope for those who could escape. If they could reach it, Eli might breathe freely again. The dream was fragile but essential. Jackson packed the few supplies they had: a crumpled map, extra masks, and a makeshift oxygenator converted from scavenged parts. It was a dangerous journey surrounded by hostile terrain, government patrols, and the ever-tightening noose of scarcity. As they snuck through abandoned subway tunnels, Jackson told Eli stories of a time when breaths were free, of grassy fields and blue skies untainted by smog. He saw in Eli's tired eyes a flicker of hope, tiny but burning bright. On the fifth night underground, Jackson encountered a ragtag group of rebels who called themselves the Breathwalkers. They were hackers, scavengers, and idealists who fought the oxygen tax by disrupting the government's control systems and smuggling oxygen to those in need. Jackson explained his situation, and unexpectedly, the group welcomed them with cautious warmth. Their leader, a sharp-eyed woman named Mira, was wary but understood the stakes. "The government wants us dependent," she said in a hushed voice. "They sell us breath one gulp at a time. We aim to breathe free again." Mira offered Jackson and Eli a place with the Breathwalkers, access to better oxygen supplies, and most importantly, a chance to join the resistance. They needed someone determined to protect the innocent, to strike back at the system that had robbed them all. Jackson accepted with determination. With Mira's guidance, Jackson learned the art of infiltration, how to hack supply lines, divert oxygen shipments, and sabotage the government's biocontrol drones. The Breathwalkers kept Eli supplied with steady flows of clean oxygen, and for the first time in weeks, the boys smiled without the shadow of suffocation looming. But it was never enough. The government's grip tightened relentlessly. The oxygen distribution system adapted, increasing surveillance, punishing even small infractions with brutal crackdowns. The air became a battlefield fought not just with guns but with laws turning breath into profit. One fateful night, the Breathwalkers mounted a bold attack on a central oxygen repository, one of the government's main nodes for credit distribution. Their plan was to seize reserves and broadcast a message exposing the tyranny behind the oxygen tax. Jackson was at the forefront, driven by the image of Eli breathing freely in the wilderness beyond the city. They hacked through layered security, triggering alarms, but their preparation held. Inside the cold vault of tanks and machines, Jackson felt a surge of triumph and fear. Suddenly, the building shook violently, an airstrike from government forces attempting to quash the rebellion. The blast shattered glass and metal. Smoke filled the rooms where the rebels fought desperately to escape with the oxygen stock. Jackson's mask slipped, his lungs constricted painfully, but his priority was Eli. Behind him, he heard shouts and the crashing footsteps of pursuers. He grabbed a secured pack loaded with extra tanks and sprinted to the extraction point, Eli in his arms. They just made it outside before the building collapsed in a burning plume. But the government was closing in fast, deploying drone swarms and armored vehicles onto the narrow streets. The Breathwalkers scattered, and Jackson knew it was time to vanish. Days passed in a blurred haze of running and hiding, until at last they reached the coordinates Mira had marked, a dense forest shrouded in mist and legend. As they crossed the eastern barrier, the air shifted dramatically, cooler, cleaner, untamed by the smog of civilization. Eli's breaths deepened involuntarily, his face relaxing for the first time in months. Jackson knelt, feeling the soil's damp earth under his hands, smelling a scent almost forgotten. It was real, pure oxygen, unmetered, unregulated. Freedom in its rawest form. They were safe here, at least for now. Unknown to them, the government was already mobilizing for a hunting expedition to reclaim the forest and crush any sanctuary of the free air movement. But as Jackson held his son close under the canopy of ancient trees, he understood that some battles were worth fighting until the last breath. The oxygen tax had tried to kill them, to turn precious air into chains. But wandering out in the wild, where the green leaves whispered promises of life unchecked, Jackson knew a revolution had already begun. The rebellion not just of breath, but of a father sworn to defy a system designed to suffocate hope itself. For more stories, like and subscribe.